The front doors of the lodge rattled so hard I thought the glass might shatter. Snow was coming down sideways, hammering against the walls like a living thing. I had just finished locking up the dining room when I saw him step inside. No sound of boots on the tile, no snow shaken from his coat. Just there, suddenly framed by the storm behind him, silent in a way that made the whole lobby feel smaller. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever stayed somewhere that carried a strange weight to it. And if these late-night stories keep you company, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. My name's Dana Ellis. I was 37 back then, working the front desk at a mountain lodge halfway up the range outside Silverton, Colorado. I had been with the place nearly 9 years by that point, long enough to know every warped floorboard and every window that whined when the wind pressed against it. Nights were quiet, especially once the ski crowd headed home. Sometimes I worked alone, though on stormy weeks Len Turner, the maintenance man, kept watch until morning in case pipes burst or generators failed. The lodge had a reputation for being sturdy. Built in the 70s, it was all heavy beams and river stone, the kind of building you'd expect to outlast its guests. But during that storm in late January, even the walls seemed to flex. The power flickered twice before midnight, and the parking lot lights went out completely, leaving the lodge looking like a single candle lost in a blizzard. I had been making tea in the staff kitchen when the outer doors pushed open and he came in. He signed the register without speaking. His handwriting was small, angled, forward a name I couldn't quite make out. I offered him a room on the second floor with a fireplace, but he only nodded not once, looking me in the eye. His coat was dusted with snow, though it never melted. It stayed clinging to the fabric like frost etched into stone. I told myself he was exhausted from the road, that sometimes travelers didn't have energy left for small talk. Len appeared a little later, grumbling about a leak near the laundry room. When I mentioned the late check-in, he raised his eyebrows. We rarely saw guests arrive that deep into a storm. Len carried himself like a man who'd seen too many winters, broad-shouldered, a little stooped hands, cracked from years of fixing things no one else noticed. He asked what room I'd given the stranger. 212, I told him. He grunted, but didn't say more. The lodge had a particular way of breathing at night. You'd hear the boiler cycling pipes shifting like old bones, timbers groaning as the wind shoved against them. That night, though, there was an added sound. A steady scrape, faint but distinct, coming from upstairs. I checked the monitor behind the desk. The hallway cameras showed nothing, just the patterned carpet, the brass wall lamps, the doors, lined in perfect silence. I decided to take a walk up myself, partly to reassure my nerves, and partly because storms always put me on edge. The second floor smelled faintly of cedar and cleaning polish, a comforting mix I'd grown used to. But as I passed room 212, I noticed the air was colder. A draft whispered around the frame, carrying with it the faintest trace of smoke, though no fire should have been lit without asking for wood service. I knocked gently, calling out to see if the guest needed anything. No answer. Just silence, thick enough I could hear the distant tick of the baseboard heater. I lingered, then moved on, telling myself he was sleeping. Still, that cold draft clung to me the whole way back down the hall. By 2 in the morning, the storm had reached its worst. Snow was piling halfway up the first-floor windows, and wind howled through the chimney flues. I was sorting through reservation slips when Len came to the desk, his face pale. He asked if I'd been upstairs. I told him yes earlier and asked why. He said he'd just come from the boiler room and swore he saw someone standing at the far end of the second-floor hallway. A man in a dark coat, motionless facing the window that looked over the parking lot. But when he climbed the stairs to check, the hallway was empty and the footprints in the carpet led nowhere. We decided to check again together. The guest in 212 never answered our knocks. Len fetched the master key, though when he slid it into the lock, the knob resisted, as if someone on the other side held it shut. After a moment, the door gave way, swinging inward onto a room perfectly in order. The bed untouched, fireplace, cold suitcase absent. Yet the register downstairs carried his name, or something like a name, in neat, slanted ink. Len muttered that storms made people see things. Maybe the stranger had left before the drifts trapped us in. Maybe we'd both been tired. But when I closed the door, I felt that same draft brush my cheek, sharp and cold, as if someone had exhaled in the dark. We returned to the desk without speaking. The storm carried on until dawn, burying the road in silence. When the plows finally carved a path through, I checked the lot. No car sat buried there, no tracks leading away, just the wind covering its own traces. The only thing left was that half-legible name. In the register, a signature that seemed to tilt farther each time I looked at it, as if the letters themselves were trying to walk away. I still keep that page folded in a drawer, and sometimes when the wind presses against my house at night, I swear I can smell that faint curl of smoke drifting from a fire no one ever lit. I don't usually talk about what happened on that trip. Most people hear it and think I'm exaggerating, or worse, making it up to sound dramatic. But the truth is quieter than that. The memory sits like a stone in the chest, heavy and unmoving, because I know exactly what we saw that afternoon and exactly how close we came to being pulled into something that would have ended badly. My name is Nathan Cole, and back then I was 34 years old, teaching history at a public high school in Denver. My wife, Jessica, ran a small online jewelry business from home, and after years of saving, we finally booked 2 weeks in France, something we had always promised ourselves we'd do before life got too busy. We weren't interested in crowded tours or city museums. We wanted quiet roads, small villages, and the countryside. We rented a little car in Lyon, and for the better part of a week, we simply drove wherever the side roads looked appealing. It was late summer, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the fields. Rows of sunflowers stretched to the horizon, their heads following the sun in eerie unison, and every few miles we'd pass a farmhouse or a stone church older than anything back home. On the afternoon that changed everything, Jessica had her camera in her lap, searching for the right kind of light. She was a collector of small details, the color of cracked shutters, ivy patterns on old walls, the way shadows fell across stone arches. She spotted an abandoned farmhouse off a dirt road, roof half collapsed, windows gone. She asked me to pull over. The building was beautiful in its ruin-weathered stone, glowing gold in the late light. But what caught my attention wasn't the farmhouse. Behind it, set back against a line of scrubby olive trees, was a modern shed, corrugated metal with a wide door propped open. It looked wrong in that setting, too new, too plain, like it had been dropped into the scene. Two vans were parked beside it, white, with license plates, so caked in dirt I couldn't read them. Jessica was adjusting her lens when I noticed movement. Two men emerged from the shed struggling with something long and heavy, wrapped tightly in a blue industrial tarp. They dragged it awkwardly, one pulling forward, the other walking backward. It sagged in the middle, and as they adjusted their grip, I saw dark stains spreading across the fabric. My first thought was livestock, a dead pig maybe, but the way they moved didn't fit. They weren't rushing, they weren't careless. They were deliberate, cautious, always glancing toward the road. Then one of them saw us. He was a large man, bald with thick arms, and hands the color of sunburned brick. His partner was younger, thin, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. For a long moment, none of us moved. The tarp slipped just enough for me to glimpse something pale inside, something shaped like a shoulder. The younger man tucked it back quickly, but it was too late. My stomach had already dropped. Jessica was still focused on her camera, oblivious, muttering about the way the shadows crossed the farmhouse wall. I remember her voice cutting through the silence light and careless, while both men stared straight at me. The bald one said something sharp to his partner, who let his end of the tarp fall into the grass. Then they set it down together almost carefully, as if setting aside a chore. The bald man walked back into the shed and returned carrying a long-handled shovel. He handed another to his partner, and without hurry, they began walking toward our car. They didn't run. They didn't yell. They just walked with this steady, unshakable pace, the kind of pace that told me they had done this before. The younger one's lips moved, as if he were whispering or praying. The bald man's face never changed blank, as stone eyes locked on us, like he had all the time in the world. Jessica finally noticed. She lowered her camera and gripped my arm hard enough to leave bruises. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Get in the car." My hands fumbled with the keys, the sound of metal against metal clumsy in the stillness. The men were closing the distance, the shovels angled in a way that looked less like tools and more like weapons. The engine coughed to life on the second try. Gravel sprayed as we lurched forward, the tires spitting dust. In the mirror, I saw them stop and watch the bald one lowering his shovel slowly to the ground. The younger man broke into a run, sprinting back toward the vans. That was when real fear hit me. They weren't going to let us go. The road twisted into the forest, narrow and uneven, the branches clawing at the roof of our rental car. Jessica tried her phone, but there was no signal. Only the steady hum of the tires and my pulse in my ears. Minutes later, headlights appeared in the mirror. A single white van gaining fast. The driver was the bald man. He wasn't reckless. He didn't try to ram us. He simply followed close, patient, as though he knew these roads would eventually give him what he wanted. Every time I took a turn too wide, his headlights slid across the trees like searchlights never losing ground. Jessica twisted in her seat, snapping photos through the rear window, the camera flash strobing inside the car. "Evidence," she muttered. "We need evidence." The flash hit the bald man square in the eyes. For the first time, his face changed. He raised one hand to shield himself, and the van swerved. I saw a stone cross marking a hidden left turn, and without signaling, I yanked the wheel. The car lifted onto two wheels before slamming back down. Jessica screamed. Luggage crashed against the doors. The van shot past the turn brakes, squealing, buying us a few precious seconds. The new road climbed steeply, and at the crest I saw houses. A cluster of them gathered around an old church laundry, swaying on lines, cars parked crooked along the square. It was a village small but alive, and it felt like a lifeline. I drove straight into the center and stopped near a cafe where older men sat playing cards. We spilled out of the car, wild-eyed Jessica clutching her camera like it was proof of our existence. I tried to explain in broken French, gesturing down the road. An older man in suspenders and a faded cap rose without a word. He walked to the middle of the street and stood there, arms crossed. Within moments, more men joined him, 5, then 6, forming a silent wall across the road. When the white van rounded the corner and saw them, it slowed. The bald man sat behind the wheel, his face shadowed, unreadable. Then, without a word, the van reversed, disappearing the way it came. Inside the cafe, the air smelled of strong coffee and cigarette smoke. Jessica showed the photos on her camera, the tarp, the van, the driver's face caught in the flash. The villagers spoke quickly among themselves, anger rising in their voices. Police arrived within 20 minutes. The photos were taken as evidence, and we were escorted back to our hotel under guard. That night, we barricaded our door with chairs, unable to sleep. The next morning, detectives told us they had searched the farm. They found the tarp streaked with blood and fresh earth turned over near the olive trees. The vans were gone. The men were gone. But now they said they had names, faces, and witnesses. Weeks later, back in Denver, Jessica received an email from the detective. Both men had been caught trying to cross into Spain with false papers. In one of the vans, police found ropes, tarps, and tools. They were linked to disappearances stretching back years. Hikers, tourists, travelers who vanished without a trace. We were the only ones who had gotten away. It has been years since then, but when I close my eyes, I still see them walking toward us across that field, shovels in hand, unhurried, patient. I hear the sound of gravel spitting under the tires as we fled, and the way the van's headlights stayed steady behind us, never faltering. Jessica hasn't taken another countryside photo since, and I have never trusted the silence of an empty road again. The last real vacation I ever planned with friends ended on a mountain road at midnight. When I think about it now, the night is all headlights and silence broken only by the sound of tires fighting for grip. If we had handled it differently, if Kevin had made one wrong decision behind the wheel, I don't think we'd have ever made it back. I was 24 then, fresh out of college and working at my first job in a Phoenix accounting firm. The hours were long, the pay low, and I had been desperate for a break. Kevin, my closest friend from high school, suggested we use his uncle's cabin in the mountains north of Payson. His girlfriend Ashley wanted to come, and so did my roommate Brandon. It was supposed to be a simple weekend away. Beer in a cooler, card games by the fireplace, and maybe a short hike if the weather held. We left on a Friday evening later than we should have. Kevin wanted to avoid traffic, which meant that by the time we got off the interstate and onto the narrow 2-lane highway, the sky was already black. The temperature had dropped fast down from the desert's 90-degree heat to the 60s in less than 2 hours. The road wound sharply, bordered on one side by forest and on the other by sheer drop-offs into shadowed ravines. By the time we hit the mountain roads, Brandon was asleep in the back seat beside me, his head against the glass and Ashley was flipping through a downloaded show on her phone since we had lost reception 20 minutes earlier. I remember feeling heavy-limbed and drowsy, lulled by the steady hum of the Jeep's engine. Then Kevin hit the brakes hard enough to jolt all of us forward. 50 yards ahead across both lanes sat a dark blue minivan with its hazard lights blinking. It looked old rust creeping around the wheel wells, one of the rear windows patched with duct tape. Both front doors stood wide open, the dome light casting a pale rectangle onto the empty road. The engine was still running. Kevin slowed to a crawl. Ashley leaned forward, asking if we should stop to help, but something in the scene felt wrong. There was no one outside waving us down, no flashlight beam, no sign of movement at all. The forest around us had gone silent. Not a single cricket or owl called from the trees. I was leaning forward between the seats when I saw them. 2 men stepped out from the tree line, almost in unison, one on each side of the road. The one to our left was tall and gaunt, wearing greasy coveralls and holding something long and heavy at his side. The other was stocky, with a baseball cap pulled low, a wooden bat resting on his shoulder. They didn't shout or wave. They just started walking toward the Jeep. Kevin didn't wait for anyone to speak. He slammed the Jeep into reverse, the tires shrieking against asphalt as we shot backward into the dark. Brandon woke instantly, grabbing my arm in confusion. The headlights of the minivan flared suddenly into high beams, blinding us. Its engine roared and the van straightened on the road before turning to follow. Driving backward at 40 miles per hour on a twisting mountain road is something no one should attempt, but Kevin didn't hesitate. His eyes were locked on the rear-view mirror, hands gripping the wheel so hard I could see the tendons stand out. I twisted around in my seat, shouting directions for each curve, my voice hoarse. Every time we swerved near the guardrail, gravel spat into the air and rattled against the undercarriage. The van stayed close, too close, its cracked windshield glowing white in our headlights. It followed each swerve like a shadow, gaining on us with patient confidence. Ashley was crying by then, muttering prayers through her hands. Brandon had his phone out, waving it toward the window, searching for signal bars that never came. When the road widened briefly at a scenic overlook, Kevin spun the Jeep in a desperate arc, tires screaming smoke rising as we did a full 180. We nearly slammed into the stone barrier before the Jeep steadied. Now pointed in the right direction, Kevin floored it, the engine howling as we shot forward. The van tried to copy our maneuver, but overshot the turn, buying us half a minute at most. For 2 minutes we sped through the black forest, the trees flashing like bars of shadow in our headlights. Then another pair of lights appeared behind us. A pickup truck had joined the chase, pulling alongside the van like they were running in formation. They knew the road better than we did. That much was clear. Where Kevin fought the wheel at every curve, their vehicles flowed with the bends, closing in little by little. I can still hear Ashley's silence in those moments. She had stopped crying, stopped speaking, just pressed her hand flat against the dashboard, knuckles, white eyes wide. Brandon kept whispering his parents' address like he was trying to anchor himself. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat, but all I could do was keep my eyes on those headlights, waiting for them to close the distance. Then, out of nowhere, Brandon shouted that he had 1 bar of signal. He dialed 911 with trembling fingers, nearly dropping the phone, when the Jeep hit a pothole that launched us upward for a split second. The call connected, his voice breaking as he shouted our location into the static. That was when I saw it, a gas station up ahead, sitting like an island of light in the dark. Its neon signs flickered and the dirty windows glowed with fluorescent tubes. Kevin swerved into the lot at the last second, bringing us to a screaming halt inches from the pumps. The van and the truck slowed as they passed. They didn't stop, didn't speed away either, just crawled by with the patience of hunters. Inside the gas station, the owner, an older man with weathered arms, covered in faded tattoos, was already reaching beneath the counter for something I prayed was more than just a phone. The men in the vehicles circled twice more before disappearing into the night. We stood in the fluorescent wash of that gas station, every nerve on fire. Brandon still clutching the phone to his ear. 20 minutes later, the state police arrived, their cruisers quiet, except for the flash of blue lights across the pumps. They took our statements, asked for descriptions, and told us we weren't the first to see something like this. Apparently, there had been at least 3 similar incidents on those mountain roads in the last 2 months. Always late at night, always targeting out-of-towners headed for cabins or rentals. The men were never caught. The van was later found burned out, its plates missing, its numbers filed away. The truck vanished completely. Kevin's Jeep never recovered from that night. The transmission was ruined, but he always said it was the best $3,000 he ever spent to replace it. Brandon moved back home to Iowa within 2 months, saying he couldn't stand the thought of being so isolated again. Ashley and Kevin split not long after, and though I still see Kevin now and then, we never bring up the mountain road. What I remember most isn't the chase itself, though, or the headlights closing in. It's the way the men stepped out from the trees in silence, confident and patient, like they owned that stretch of road and knew we were already caught. I think about how many other drivers saw those same figures and didn't have a gas station waiting at the end of their escape. I grew up thinking hospitals were the safest places in the world. When I finally worked in one, I learned how often safety was only an illusion, paper thin, against what you couldn't explain away. At the time, I was 31 and working nights in a county hospital outside Tulsa. The job wasn't glamorous, but the pay was steady, and after years of travel contracts, I wanted something stable. Nights in the ER usually meant a rhythm of drunks, car wrecks, and the endless drone of fluorescent lights overhead. We learned to live by the hum of vending machines, the smell of burnt coffee, and the steady voice of the overhead intercom. The building itself was old, parts of it dating back to the 1960s, with wings added on as the city grew. That meant long, confusing corridors, where linoleum changed color halfway down the hall, and certain units sat half abandoned, used only for storage. The one we all avoided was called Unit 47 Delta. It was a pediatric wing, closed more than 10 years before I started shut down after funding cuts. The rooms were stripped bare, lights off, doors locked, but sometimes when I walked past the stairwell that led to it, I swore I felt a draft from behind the door. The night it happened was one of those stretches where nothing seemed to move. Midnight to 3 a.m. can feel endless in a hospital when no traumas come in. I was restocking IV kits at the nurse's station when I heard the voice on the security radio. I wasn't supposed to have one, but Michael, the guard on nights, often left his handheld sitting on the counter when he came by for coffee. The voice was small, almost swallowed by static, but clear enough. "Can somebody please come? I'm lost." Michael came back just as the words crackled through. He froze, mid-step, his eyes flicking to the radio like it had betrayed him. I remember asking if that was one of the patients, maybe a kid with a phone, but his face stayed hard. He told me no phones connected to that channel. It was a closed system, only hospital security and maintenance. Before I could ask more, the voice returned softer, trembling. "It's cold down here." Then the sound of muffled crying. Michael picked up the radio, pressing the button, asking for a name, a location, but only static answered back. His knuckles whitened around the device. Not 20 minutes later, one of the overhead motion sensors tripped on Unit 47 Delta. The feed showed on the small monitor at the desk. The camera quality was bad, grainy, and discolored, but you could see a shadow moving across the empty hall. Too small to be an adult. Michael cursed under his breath and said he had to check it out. Against my better judgment, I followed. Hospitals feel different when you leave the lit corridors. The stairwell leading down was half dark, the bulb flickering the air, heavy with dust. Michael's keys jangled as he unlocked the metal door, and for a moment I hoped we wouldn't hear anything on the other side. But as the door creaked open, a sound drifted up the echo of sobbing, faint but steady, carrying through the dark. We moved slowly down the hallway. The smell was sharp, like old disinfectant clinging to tile. Our shoes scuffed dust into the silence. Michael called out his voice, steady, saying we were here to help, asking the boy to come toward us. The crying didn't stop, but it didn't come closer either. It seemed to move from one room to another, always just beyond the edge of sight. In one doorway, I swear I saw movement the shape of a child, thin hair hanging across his forehead, turning away as the flashlight beam found him. Michael swore and moved faster, but when we stepped into the room, it was empty, only a broken bed frame against the wall and peeling paint on the ceiling. The radio crackled again in Michael's hand. This time, the boy whispered, "I can't find the way out." His voice was closer now, clearer than before, like he was standing just beyond the open door. Michael swept his light down the hall, and that was when every motion sensor along the unit clicked on, in order one by one, chasing something we couldn't see. The lights glowed down the corridor like dominoes falling. By the time they reached the far end, the crying had stopped. We searched every room, nothing. No footprints in the dust, no unlocked windows, no trace of anyone at all. By the time we got back upstairs, Michael's face looked gray, and he told me not to mention it. He said the unit had a history, a boy who'd gone missing during a fire drill back before it closed. They had searched every inch, every vent and stairwell, but his body was never found. Some of the older staff still refused to walk near the wing at night. I lasted another 6 months at that hospital before moving on. Even now, when I hear the squawk of a two-way radio or catch the faint echo of a child's voice in a public place, my chest tightens. I know what Michael and I heard, and I know what we saw on that monitor. What stays with me most is the last transmission that came through before the static swallowed it. A whisper so faint I almost doubted it, but it carried a weight I'll never forget. "Please, don't turn off the lights." The strangest things I've ever seen in my life didn't happen when I was young or reckless, but when I was just trying to make ends meet. Back in 2022, I worked nights at a gas station off Highway 285 outside Alamosa, Colorado. The place was a lonely little box of fluorescent light in the middle of miles of dark, empty highway. Nights stretched long and quiet, broken only by the hum of the coolers and the occasional 18-wheeler pulling in for fuel. It was in late November, bitterly cold, when I first noticed him. He pulled up in a beat-up sedan with mismatched panels, the kind of car you'd expect to see abandoned behind a junkyard. He came inside wearing a blue hoodie pulled tight around his face. He didn't make small talk, didn't even glance at the candy racks. He just laid down $12, exactly cash folded crisp, and walked back out without a word. The register read 3:17 a.m. when I rang it in. At first, I thought nothing of it. People drift through those roads at odd hours, and you stop trying to guess their stories. But the next night at precisely the same time, the same man walked in, laid down the same $12, and left without saying a thing. Same hoodie, same car, same stiff way of moving, like every step was rehearsed. I watched him drive off, tail lights shrinking against the horizon, and for the first time in a long while, I felt uneasy in my own store. By the fourth night, I was timing it without meaning to. I found myself checking the clock as the minutes crept toward 3:17, feeling a knot form in my chest. And sure enough, right on time, his headlights appeared from the same direction, easing into the same pump. He never bought food, never used the restroom, never spoke a word. Just $12 of gas, not a penny more, not a cent less. I started mentioning it over the radio to the regional dispatcher we used for routine check-ins. She laughed at first, said maybe the guy just had a ritual, but by the seventh night, her voice didn't sound amused anymore. She suggested I make a note of his plates. When I stepped outside the next night to catch them, I realized something that chilled me far worse than the wind. There were no plates, just empty brackets where they should have been. One evening, a state trooper stopped in around midnight for coffee, and I told him the whole thing. He smiled politely at first, then his face tightened when I said the exact time, every single night, and the missing plates. He stayed with me past 3. That night, parked in the corner of the lot with his cruiser. Lights dimmed. At 3:17, the sedan rolled in just like always. The trooper's eyes went wide. He pulled out fast, blocking the pump, stepping out with his flashlight raised. What happened next never made sense to me. The man in the hoodie didn't run. He didn't argue. He just stood there staring at the trooper through the glass like he didn't understand what was happening. Then, as quick as a blink, he got back in his car, reversed in a straight line across the lot, and sped off without headlights into the dark. The trooper chased him, but by the time they reached the next junction, the car had vanished. No tracks in the frost, no sign on the highway cameras. For a week, nothing happened. I convinced myself maybe it was over. Maybe the trooper's presence had scared him off. But then one night when the store was quiet, I glanced at the pump monitor. And there it was. Pump 3 had activated at 3:17 a.m., $12 flat. Only the lot was empty. No headlights, no car, no figure in a hoodie walking toward the door. The receipt printed anyway. I still have it dated and time-stamped with the same total. The register drawer opened with a chime, waiting for cash that was never placed there. I stood alone in that fluorescent box, holding that strip of paper, realizing I had no way to explain what had just happened. I left the job not long after. The receipt is tucked in an envelope in my desk drawer at home, Sometimes I take it out just to stare at the numbers, the tiny inked line that ties me back to those nights. It isn't proof in any courtroom sense, but I know what I saw. Or maybe, more importantly, what I didn't see. And even now, if I'm awake late enough, I catch myself glancing at the clock as the minutes crawl toward that familiar mark. I don't work the graveyard anymore, but part of me still braces for the sound of a door opening, for the shuffle of footsteps, and for a folded bill laid silently on the counter at exactly 3:17 a.m. I don't usually tell this story because it makes me sound like I've gone a little off the rails. But it happened, and it stuck with me, and I've never been able to explain it. Back in 2021, I was working as a heavy truck mechanic out in the Nevada desert. Most of my jobs were roadside calls crawling under rigs on stretches of highway, where you could drive 30 miles in either direction without seeing another living soul. That spring, I had a contract near Goldfield, which isn't much more than a bend in the road with a couple of old buildings leaning against the wind. I'd sometimes stay out there in my truck when the jobs ran long, listening to the hum of the desert at night. The sound is strange out there. Flat, dry air carrying every little thing, the grind of a distant engine, the rattle of loose gravel, even the way your own breath sounds inside the cab. One night around 2 in the morning, I was parked off Highway 95, finishing a job on a refrigerated trailer that had blown a belt. My tools were spread across the dirt, and the only light came from my lantern and the stars. That's when my CB crackled. Not the faint chatter of truckers passing through, but a direct, clear voice cutting through, like it was meant just for me. Unit 12. Do you copy? It didn't make sense. I wasn't tied into any law enforcement frequency. I used a regular CB band, the same kind every trucker and roadside worker used. I picked up the receiver anyway, mostly out of habit. Go ahead, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The reply came quick. 2 suspects in stolen vehicle heading southbound, last seen near Goldfield. Black SUV, no plates. Proceed with caution. I froze there in the dirt, one hand on the wrench, one hand gripping the receiver. Whoever this was, they weren't talking to me. They were talking to police units. And yet, for some reason, the call had bled straight into my channel. I didn't respond again. I just sat there staring out at the empty highway stretching south into blackness. The desert looked the same as it always did, flat and endless. The road a pale ribbon under the stars. But after that broadcast, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, moving closer. About 10 minutes later, headlights appeared on the horizon. A black SUV moving fast, coming from the exact direction dispatch had mentioned. I backed up toward my truck, heart pounding harder with each second. The SUV slowed as it reached my spot, engine rumbling low, and for a moment it felt like the desert air had gone completely still. 2 men sat inside, faces hidden in shadow, watching me, as if weighing something I couldn't read. Then the driver hit the gas, and the SUV roared past, taillights disappearing into the dark. Not 5 minutes later, another voice came through my CB. This one was firm-clipped, unmistakably law enforcement. Be advised, suspects just passed mile marker 192. My eyes flicked to the post near the shoulder. That was me. Mile marker 192. Whoever was broadcasting was speaking about the exact spot where I was standing down to the foot. The rest of the night passed in a haze of unease. Highway patrol cars streaked by hours later, red and blue lights strobing against the rocks, but they never stopped, and they never came back. The SUV was never recovered, at least not in any report I could find. For weeks afterward, I kept thinking about that call. Why had it come through my radio, out of all the receivers on that desert stretch? And why had the dispatcher mentioned my mile marker as if it were already part of the pursuit? I left Nevada a few months later, but I kept the same CB. It sits on a shelf in my garage now, and sometimes late at night, when the world feels quiet enough, I plug it in just to listen. Most of the time, it's nothing but static and truckers jawing about weather. But every so often, when the clock drifts close to 2 a.m., I hear that same voice break through, clear as day, calling out to units that I know can't hear it anymore. And I can't shake the thought that someday I'll answer again, and this time whoever's on the other end will be waiting for me. I was 19 the year I moved into my first off-campus apartment. It was a squat brick building just outside Ann Arbor, the kind of place where the paint peeled in corners and the heating only worked when it felt like it. The rent was cheap enough that students overlooked the cracks in the ceiling and the sound of pipes knocking in the walls. And for me, it was freedom. I didn't notice anything unusual at first other than the fact that one unit on the ground floor, 1A, always seemed dark no matter the time of day. When I picked up my keys, the property manager offhandedly mentioned that 1A was leased to a man who traveled often. I never saw him, though, and for months the blinds stayed drawn, and the air outside that door smelled faintly of mildew. Most tenants didn't talk much, so I let it go, telling myself some people just wanted privacy. The first strange thing happened in late November. I was walking back from a night lab around 2 in the morning when I saw someone standing outside 1A. The figure was tall, bundled in a heavy coat, and leaning close to the door like he was listening. I almost said something, but before the words left my mouth, the man turned away and walked quickly down the hall without acknowledging me. The next morning, the hallway smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, though no one in the building smoked inside. After that, I began to notice people outside that door more often. Sometimes a woman in a red scarf, sometimes a pair of men who lingered at the corner near the stairwell, always at night, never saying a word to me. They never knocked. They just waited for long minutes at a time, standing motionless until something unseen seemed to signal them to leave. One night I called the property manager and asked if anything was going on with 1A. She sighed like she'd heard the question before and told me the tenant paid on time, nothing else to worry about. When I pressed, she grew sharp, telling me to mind my own business. By January, it was more than once or twice a week. I'd be lying in bed, and through the thin floor I'd hear footsteps gathering at the door below me. They were never hurried, never panicked, just slow, shuffling movements, sometimes joined by a faint tapping sound like fingers brushing lightly against wood. When I finally mustered the nerve to peek one night, pulling back my curtain just an inch, I counted 6 people clustered outside 1A, all standing in silence, facing the door, their breath steaming in the cold air, drifting through the drafty entrance. I called the police after that. The officer who showed up did a sweep, knocked on 1A, and finally came back to me shaking his head. "Place is empty," he said. "Looks like it's been that way a while. You sure you saw what you saw?" I wanted to insist, but the words dried up in my mouth. He gave me his card, Officer Lyman, and told me to call if it happened again. For a few weeks, things went quiet. Then in February, I woke at exactly 2:17 a.m. to a sound that still gives me chills. The door below me creaked open, hinges, groaning in a way I'd never heard before. I crept to the window, heart racing, and through the narrow curtain gap, I saw the door to 1A standing half open. Inside, there was no light, just darkness, swallowing everything beyond the threshold. One by one, 5 figures slipped inside. The door closed softly behind them. I waited for hours, staring out the window, but no one ever came back out. By morning, the hallway was empty, and when I went downstairs pretending to check my mail, the door to 1A was shut tight again. I touched the handle. It was cold, almost damp, as if it had been left outside all night in the snow. The next week, Officer Lyman called me back. He said they'd run a check on the lease. According to records, no one had ever rented Unit 1A. The apartment wasn't even listed as habitable. It was storage sealed years earlier after a burst pipe ruined the foundation. There shouldn't have been furniture lights or locks. He told me maybe I'd mixed up the numbers. Maybe I meant 1B or 1C. I didn't argue. A month later, I moved out. I told my friends it was because of noisy neighbors and the lousy heating, but the truth was I couldn't stand walking past that door anymore. Even when it was quiet, I could feel something gathering behind it, waiting for night to fall. Sometimes I dream about that hallway, the cold linoleum under my feet, the smell of mildew, the line of strangers standing outside a door that doesn't lead anywhere. In the dream, they all turn at once, and their faces are pale, blank, and patient, as if they've been waiting for me to finally open it. That was the last memory I have to share tonight. Looking back, I think about how many of these stories began in places meant to be ordinary. A roadside diner, a motel, a stretch of highway, an apartment hallway. None of them seemed remarkable at first glance, yet each one carried a weight that lingers long after the moment has passed. What unsettles me most isn't the fear itself, but the silence that follows. The quiet diner parking lot after footsteps fade, the endless highway once the headlights are gone, the hallway that looks untouched in daylight. It's as though the world leaves no trace of what you've witnessed leaving you, to wonder if the terror lived only inside your memory. And maybe that's why these stories cling so tightly to us. They remind us that unease doesn't always come with answers. Sometimes it lives in the shadows of the most ordinary places, waiting patiently to be remembered when night falls again. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Sharing these stories with you tonight has been a quiet comfort, even if the memories themselves are uneasy. If you'd like to hear more nights like this, please consider subscribing and sharing these stories with someone who might listen beside you. Before you drift off, tell me, have you ever lived somewhere even for a short while that didn't feel empty when it should have good night?